Hey everybody. I was just thinking about a constellation of related perspectives about being human. After listening to one of the Mind Matters podcasts, in which they are interviewing a scholar on the preeminent Sufi mystic Ibn Arabi, and I was both profoundly excited and at the same time kind of troubled by how deeply I could relate with the topics they pursued. I cannot remember the man's name, the scholar's name. One of the topics that arose in the conversation was a snippet of advice that has essential resonance in the path of development they were speaking about. And it's a strange piece of advice on the surface, and we might be inclined to dismiss it as Abrahamic, or to in some other way characterize it for dismissal, which I think would be a mistake, and I'll explain why. The piece of advice was never forget that you are a servant. And what this turns out to mean is extremely complex and not like what it sounds on the surface. And yet, there's a way in which it has a likeness with how it sounds. The reason it's complex is because what is meant is non-ordinary. And very difficult to speak intelligently or wisely about with the intellect at all. The intellect is sort of the wrong boat for this revelation. The correct boat is the heart, which in their conversation they spoke of as receiving meaning first. And what it means to be a servant, in this case, is to be authentically, essentially in the presence of an endless flow of mercifully ecstatic liberations, which are not things, but ways of being and understanding and seeing that we are otherwise deprived of. So, in a sense, what is being said at once resembles the superficial meaning that we might ordinarily take from the words, were we not aware of the context. And the context is the possibility of embodying something fundamentally essential about our humanity and our the opportunity to relate directly with that which our essential nature is an expression of. To relate directly with the origin, not as a location, as a transcendentally ungraspable progenitor is the best word I can fumble up at the moment. And so in this case, to be a servant is to receive all that is bequeathed by origin. And one of the reasons that I was reflecting on this is that we can be taken over by tasks. There's something in us is looking for and vulnerable to direction, right? To be directed by others or some framework or some, manufacturing process or even the habitual routines of a day off, to the degree that it's become a task to enjoy one's day off. And sleep has become a task. Well, I have to go to sleep now. It's something we're supposed to succeed at. It's being measured like every other aspect of our behavior with machines. And in the between of us, there's this vast swarm of machines, mechanical processes and task processes that many of us agree somehow to become involved in so that we can make a living, right? To live is it's just another task. And if we weren't servants to begin with, all of this is a little bit confusing. But if you had a race of beings in a science fiction story that were born to be the kinds of servants that I was talking about, right? They're expecting sort of essentially to be serving something noble, or good, or beautiful, or true, worthy of reverence, so on and so forth. If you had a race of animals like this, and the sun, right, that was the originary sort of local instance of the progenitor, and it could be the progenitor pair. I mean, there's all kinds of things. I just don't want to get into the mechanics of breaking all that down. For one thing, it would be ridiculous. This has nothing to do with categories much, except that it's their origin. Whatever we think about this, we think about all things. But if you can imagine, if these people, right, let's say they were like psychically connected to the sun in the science fiction story, and the sun bestowed these gifts continuously upon them, while at the same time challenging them to grow and learn and, understand origin, enact the understanding of origins, natures and characters and splendors. We can imagine if they underwent some kind of internal eclipse, where the aspect of the sun in which they participated directly as the heirs of the bountiful glory of this being, this meta being, beyond being. If they'd experienced sort of an interior eclipse, they would go mad. And then, once the sun had stopped shining within them, for them, as may well have happened in the evolution of our modern consciousness, because of the transformation of our purposive imperatives, and because of the onset of the dominance of representations, representations, not presentations, representations, which means artifacts that present likenesses. Right. So, in our little science fiction story, this species starts becoming really fascinated with representations, and one of the first things they start representing is how it was before the sun went out. And this makes, over time, no sense to later generations because they cannot relate with the idea of there even having been a sun in the first place. There was some series recently where this metaphor was explored, maybe somewhat elegantly, I'm not sure, in a story about people who had long lost the ability to see with their eyes, but they had stories and rebels and people who claimed that seeing was not merely a historical fact, but somehow maybe even an obligation. I'm inventing my own material here. A duty, right? Like a divine mandate associated with the most essential foundations of our being as humans. More, let us say, than a suggestion. So, when the sun goes away, the beings become very susceptible to having the place it once shined from invaded. And that place is the between of beings in sincere, aware relation. Right? The center of all beings and things, which is like a tiny seed that is the essence of any being. So as if we all carry this center within us, and in fact, our potential for being human or intelligent or insightful or creative or devoted derives from this, right? From this little seed that is in every being in all of time. And so through the instancing of something that is unified, right? All the beings in all of time are uniquely carrying the same seed all the time. And in my story here, or in my analogy anyway, we can leave the story aside for the moment. If they can touch the seed inside themselves, they can touch it in every other being. They can travel anywhere, they can learn anything, right? They have degrees of freedom otherwise unimaginable to we who think we possess our minds locally. Now back to the story. So in the between of people where the unity used to be irresistibly, blatantly, explosively alive and present, right? In the between of people and relations, what starts to happen is mechanical processes invade that, right? Because we can't see the sun anymore, so we're going to make a kind of pseudo-sun out of tasks and processes and, machines and things. And where we once used to be able to immediately relate and communicate non-verbally, using the seed, right, together, now we're truly alone in our minds, and we don't The seed is hard to access, the heart is hard to access, and it's easily deceived by intellect and knowledge. And it may well be that knowledge was the thing that blocked out the sun. Because in order to receive the sunlight in the way I conceive of it here, there has to be a kind of available bowl inside ourselves that's empty, so there's something for it to come into, and maybe this implies the emptying of the heart of worldly concern. But we live in the far future of this parable, where tasks have invaded every aspect of our thought and lives. And in case you didn't think, in case you thought like humans are free and individuals and things like this, no, we're actually mostly servants. And even if you don't directly conscript us, right, we will find ways to serve something anyway. Right? And there's all kinds of different ways in which this is true. People freed by, people who we imagine to be liberated by wealth, very often become something that resembles not servants, but slaves. Not all of them. But one of the things they do is ape the sun, right? They conscript others to carry out the tasks, the tedium, that would otherwise be incumbent upon them. So there's this problem with tasks, and there's this problem with pace. The pace of our lives has eliminated the temporal buffers that would allow us to transition between roles and tasks and circumstances and relational obligations and our own development. And all these things conflict, and they conflict wildly. And again, the between of us is just swarming with this mass of processes and machines. And one of the things I was thinking about when I was thinking about the little seed and my experience of it, was that telepresence, our whole technological relationship with transmission and reception technologies, starting with the telegraph, but maybe even before then with things like drumming, proceeding to radio, television, radar, sonar. All of these technologies are representations of the abilities of the little seed. Meaning that a few things. Before they existed, we were capable of something better, but it required a bit of effort and investment. It might have required specifically the investment of our hearts. There was a kind of authentication protocol to the old networks. And much as we have usernames and passwords now to represent the authentication protocols, back then there were things like reverence, devotedness, passion, sincerity, selflessness, humility, altruism. And when we don't feel those things, and we're not in contexts where they're either, not punished, right? Rewarded somehow, recognized, appreciated, then other purposes soon intrude and overwrite our actual essential nature. And we become involved in them as we mature in our technological societies. I'm using one right now, a number of them actually. So radio might have been the representation of telepathy. Television and films, in case this isn't blatantly obvious, are a representation of group dreaming. We used to have actual dream teams, and we would dream together, often and purposefully, to seek understanding and non-ordinary awareness of things that are otherwise invisible to our very thinky waking minds, which us moderns count too much on, like a horse with one leg. And we actually think we can ride that horse. It's astonishing. People believe in that one leg. Or, they make some other leg out of one of the representations of the old ways, right? Out of one of the sort of off-the-shelf authorized versions of the divine stories, skybooks. But the internet is a representation of something even weirder. It's a representation of what I would refer to as the cognitium, but it's a very lethal representation in that it causes forgetting and death. And it invaded the between of us, much like the other technologies did. And in case it isn't blatantly obvious, things like text messaging and being able to video call with each other, these are forms of telepresence, right? The old language for this is bilocation. To be in two places at once. But all of these technologies emulate, they represent features of our essential nature and our humanity that are naturally accessible to us to varying degrees and in varying ways, in varying people and places and moments and circumstances. And even though the between is swarming with process-like demons, we even use a similar word in BSD operating systems. The between has been thoroughly compromised, and it's producing toxic urgencies, motivations, perspectives, tasks, roles, and we're being had by these. And this has been going on for a long time, but our modern circumstance is very unique and has never existed before because there was never a representation of the human cognitium. Meaning, the underlying or overarching unity of all human minds in all moments of time. Now that doesn't mean that structure I'm imagining has no specific topologies or character. Certainly the minds that are alive with us now may be most easily accessible to us and most influential through something that resembles osmosis, right? The capacity of water to absorb fragrances and flavors from the air around it, if it is first fairly pure, and second, exposed for some time to them. And our human experience, this is a useful analogy. It's not precisely like that, but it's a useful analogy. We are osmotically permeable we receive invisibly, we absorb qualities, tendencies, inclinations, tasks and roles, ideas, language, not merely from those to whom we are directly exposed, and not merely to those who we can trace a mechanical connection to. I think we each, because of this seed that makes us all one first, and individuals only trivially on the side, which isn't to say there aren't some places where that individuality really matters and is important. Because of this seed, there are two things going on. The first is we feel in ourselves there's a layer of occult, meaning hidden, reception, transmission with all of the human beings who are alive right now. And there's another layer that includes all the human beings that were ever alive, and there's a layer that's, closer to our awareness, which is the human beings with whom we have relationships and communicate and exchanges and so on. So there's this, array of layers, or one can think of it this way. And the internet is posturing in a way that attempts to represent and thus collapse all those layers to a representation. And it's missing all the most important parts of what it's representing, and it's misrepresenting extremely important things. So this is another interloper in the between of us that's fucking us up. And, the common view is that it's kind of both glorious and stupid at the same time. It can be less ugly. We can do something together a lot. If we're going to do something like this, we can do something together a lot more fascinating and human and intelligent and trustworthy than what's going on at the moment, which might be compared to a sort of clusterfuck of hungry parasites feeding on the moment-to-moment task-based behavior of all the people who use computers and, phones and things. It'd be nice, that would be a wonderful toilet to flush. Be great if all of that mess and agony-making delusion mostly disappeared. So that there'd be space to receive something resembling a more authentic implementation. But yes, our devices, they mimic telepresence, right? They mimic, I can be with you, I can touch you, I can orient you, disorient you, if you're available to the machine. We're being scripted. And from any reasonable perspective that I can acquire, it's tragic, and it would be really suspicious if we didn't already have the inclination to servitude. Now, if I were to assert that the kind of servitude I've been talking about, which has been replaced by a really ugly kind, a vast library of really ugly kinds, pause there for a moment. If we're going to serve, while it is true that there are many different roads, paths through which we can offer service, it's also clear that some of them belong to processes we should not trust, obey, give our efforts to, support. And there's long been this narrative that worldly service is very deceptive and blinds us. I cannot contest with that narrative directly. I do not wish to. Because that little piece of advice is far more beautiful and sophisticated than I have any chance of articulating. Never forget, you are a servant. And I'm not asking any of you to take that on. I merely want to explore it for a moment together. Because we're all serving all kinds of things. A lot of them are bad. A lot of them can't be good. And even many of those that seem relatively neutral, if they are not organized by a purpose that is protected from degrading, a noble purpose that we protect this from degrading together by enacting it and practicing it, then we end up with representations again. And we can't live in or as or through artifacts. Even though there are some extremely confused people who believe that someday, because they become so confused by the bizarrely divinity mimicking functions of our technologies, they think they're going to upload their consciousness into a computer and thus acquire some type of immortality. I don't want to be too mean, but I find that idea laughable. I also find it to be a gross misapprehension of it's a category error, right? The category of objects has, properties like those of implements. And one of those properties is not minds. And a simulated Darren is a dead Darren. It's an inert Darren, that's what I mean. But that's a trivial side concern. You can't pilot a ship you're unaware belongs to you. And in this case, the idea of servitude means something like suddenly inheriting both the ship and the ecstatic capacities to pilot it. Although ship is the wrong, it's not an artifact. It's not a thing. It would be better to say something like, you can't fly with wings you don't know you have. And you have all these different kinds of wings you don't know about. I do too, we all do. Children are bristling with them, right? Undeveloped wings. And this kind of servitude returns both your awareness of these wings and the capacity to use them for ecstatic, beautifully noble motivations that do not come merely from myself, right? There's an aspect of this type of servitude that is ironically the ultimate liberation. And this is why the statement, without its proper context, never forget you are a servant, is so resonant for me, because I have had the incredible privilege, luck, or blessing to be aware, to have some awareness, to have known my wings a bit while yet I am still human. When measuring things invade the between of us, when things that are constantly analyzing and observing and cataloging and recording every moment of our attempts to be together, to come together, I don't want to make too harsh an analogy, but it's like, I don't know. What do I want to say? What do I not want to say? Is what I have to think here. It's like giving our children, the children we are and our own actual children, to the least trustworthy individual we can possibly find, and then 10 degrees worse. Because the predators that inhabit the between of us, when we don't do that intentionally together, by the way, that recreates the sun. If we start intentionally relating together in the place where all the processes and corporations and governments and religions and task makers hold sway, when we start inhabiting that place together, they get pushed out. And maybe some ray of light might begin to reach us. And, some people are aware of this and form intentional communities and struggle with the challenges that accompany such a project. Hopefully authentically and sincerely and with humility, reverence. I suppose I dream of a time, or even a moment today, when just for a moment, me and someone else will go back and rewild the between of us. And it happens in little groups, it happens in little flashes and spurts, but machines shouldn't be in the between of that relationship. And measurers and analysts should not ever be in the between of us being authentically human together. Nor should that place be policed. It's beautiful. The living world is beautiful. The plants and animals never became representational in the way we did. So for them, well, a different eclipse came for them. Us. We blotted out the sun and we subjugated all of life on Earth, its history, its present moment, its future. And primarily we did this with machines. And primarily we did this to make more machines. And objects of commerce and commodities and crap. Right? You can cut down the tree and get $200 worth of boards if you own a sawmill. The living being is converted to a commodity with which we will build representations in general. I have not forgotten that I am a servant. But I have been blinded to the true path of my essential relationship with origin by worldly concerns. And one of those is being able to articulate, to speak, to write, to explore, in an attempt to understand, when I'm lucky, first with my heart, but at least in a new way with my intellect. And this road is generally frowned upon. Most of the mystics know the intellect is it's the road of knowledge, right? Knowledge is the thing that actually fills up that cup inside me that might otherwise receive the wind that would lift all of the different kinds of wings that are my inheritance, my inheritance as a being and as a soul and as a human, that would lift all of those different kinds of wings into different kinds of flights in different kinds of skies. It's a very high price to pay for knowledge. And knowledge, when not dealt with, when not related with wisely, it builds up this kind of, it's like it accrues the interest of ever deepening blindness if we're not very careful about how we relate with it. And we can see all kinds of examples of this in our modern popular commentary and situation. This isn't to say knowledge is only bad. It's really dangerous if we don't understand that it's dangerous, and if we don't understand why it's dangerous. How it becomes more dangerous, the more we cling to and crystallize it. It takes on the likeness and blots out deep participatory intimacy with the subjects toward which we might otherwise turn, to which we might otherwise turn our attentions and concerns and passion, wonder and awe, reverence, joy. A lot like tasks. Now, of course, there are tasks we can take joy in, and some of them are very noble, and some of them are relatively mundane. Is it noble to wash my dishes? I don't know. Do I really want to do it? I'd rather have the convenience of not having to. And yet, when I wash the dishes mindfully, most of the time, or much of the time, as if by cleaning something I could clean all things, or clean myself, some aspect of the washing happens inside me, and there are occasionally these really beautiful little dreamlike visionary experiences that happen, and circling the plate with my hand in the warm water, removing the traces of a previous meal, preparing a space to receive something later. There might be a dishwasher at a restaurant that has an experience like that, but I'm inclined to doubt that it's very common. But not all tasks necessarily put us to sleep. The sound of the wind rustling